Welcome to the latest episode of Lean in Leander. The second interview in the Vote in Leander series for the 2022 election is with Bill Louden, who is running for place 5 on City Council. I had the opportunity to sit down with Bill last week and have a conversation, learn a little bit more about him and what he sees for the future of Leander. It was a very interesting interview. I enjoyed the conversation with Bill, and I certainly hope that you will as well. So, without any further ado, here's my talk with Bill. Welcome to the podcast, and joining me here today is Bill Louden, who is a candidate for place 5 in the upcoming City Council race. Bill, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really looking forward to this. You are one of the newer faces who have thrown their hat in the ring, so to speak. And, looking over your bio and whatnot, I would think it's fair to say that you bring a wealth of experience to the group. So I definitely want to touch base on a few of the things that you've done in your lifetime. But I'd like to start with basically where you're from. So how did you get to Leander, and where did that journey start?
I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm first generation American. I'm the eldest of 10 kids. Grew up in rather poor surroundings in an industrial city. My high school teacher told me I was too poor and too stupid to go to college, so he was trained me to work in the steel mills.
Okay.
I did that one summer, and I said, that's tough work. I've got to do something else.
Okay. So you say you're first generation American. What kind of heritage do you bring with you?
My parents were Canadian. Well, my
Okay.
mom was American. My father was Canadian, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather. We were in Canada probably from the early 1800s.
Okay.
And I think during the 1930s, my grandparents moved to America. They tell a story about their doctors telling them that when they were getting older, they should move south to America for their health. And they thought Traverse City, Michigan was south enough. So, but my father became a U.S. citizen in the Second World War as a Canadian. And they were in North Africa pushing back Rommel. And he became a citizen in Bizerte, Tunisia, of all places. He was naturalized, which I found it very strange and interesting on his records. But so I call myself first generation American. It brings with it all those kind of challenges I think most first generation people have. Just even though it's Canada, it's kind of close to who we are. A lot of things are a little different. My father was a machinist, worker, blue collar worker, heavy blue collar worker, and he taught me very early in life that hard work is what it takes to work off, and then hard work and education is what I have always believed in.
No, it's super interesting. I'm first generation as well, but I come from South, neighbors to the South. So I can kind of definitely empathize and understand some of the challenges that you're referring to there, because it is. I mean, when your parents are not native, I don't think that they've necessarily learned all of the lessons of an American, maybe. I guess that's the best way to put it. So I've always found it to be one of the things that I really try to impart to my kids is like, hey, there's ways to be successful and ways to find success in this country. And again, kind of hearkening to the hard work and education that you so eloquently touched on there. So definitely can concur with those points. I for sure.
My first job, I was 11 years old. It was time to go out and earn some money, and made 50 cents an hour, which is unbelievable today. Mm-hmm. I came back home with my first paycheck of $7.50, and my dad said, "You're a working stiff now, $5 room and board." That was my first lesson in life, that you've got to pay your own way. As soon as you're able, got to pay your own way.
That's a great story. I really like that one. Thanks for sharing. That's cool. I can't say that my parents were the same, but I do have stories about walking home in the snow with holes in my shoes. So we'll save those for another day. But I definitely can relate. So now you're in Leander. How long have you lived in Leander? I think I read in your bio that you spent some time in Cedar Park, so you've kind of been in the area for a while.
Roughly 15 years. in Leander.
Okay.
Texas, about 30 years in Texas. I got to Houston first in '91, and then I did a brief stint back out in Silicon Valley, Cupertino, et cetera, and back here. And I came back to Austin in 2002, and then to Leander in 2006.
Gotcha. So in Houston, and again, going kind of from your bio, I'm assuming that maybe that was where you were doing some work with GE. Would I be correct in that?
I had left GE at that point in time. I was
Okay.
working for a small company doing internet stuff called US Videotel. And they were building something on a French model at the time that was challenging. When I got there to take over the company, they were already 70 million bucks in debt, and it was a challenge to get them back to a more break-even basis.
So going back again a little bit to that kind of GE timeframe, before you did your work with GE and entered into the business community here in the States, you were a veteran of the Vietnam conflict, correct?
Yes, right.
And how did you serve? I mean, thank you for your service, and what was that service?
Well, it was a different time. President Kennedy was killed on my 17th birthday.
Wow.
So 9 days later, December 1st, I went down to enlist in the service. It seemed like that was the thing to do, and did. The U.S. Navy I joined made me finish high school. Thankfully, finished high school, did my boot camp, and was off on my first cruise into the Mediterranean. When that was 63. December 63, I had joined, and by 64, I'm on the ships. In early 65, President Johnson came out with a request that military personnel already in the service volunteer for Vietnam, and I volunteered for Vietnam. It was the thing you did back then. I think when the president calls, our job was to answer, and that's what I did. My experience in Vietnam was perhaps not as traumatic as many aboard ship, although we had our own combat issues. But I did my two tours in Vietnam, finished the Navy, and did 4 years as a reservist. And that gave me the opportunity to go to college with the GI Bill. I worked for a couple of years as a Department of Defense contractor for Union Carbide. We were doing back then, and this is in the late 60s, rechargeable batteries, which are like commonplace today. So we did a lot of research on those back those days. But I had a chance to go to college. I was studying electrical engineering in school. When I got to college, I realized that my English education in high school was pretty substandard. Okay. They were training me to work in blue collar industry. Right. So I changed my major to English literature, which I loved, and secondly, Japanese literature, which I enjoyed quite a bit. And that, to me, was the entire business. How I eventually got into the internet. It was about the entire internet's about interacting and communicating with other people, regardless of age, gender, nationality, culture. It was just that wonderful thing we built even before you had video, of just being able to talk to one another and learn things about different cultures. So my English background gave me that start to that. I met my wife in college. We bought one-way plane tickets to Japan after I graduated. Went over there and taught English for a couple of years. Came back. My first real job was working at Radio Shack, and I was a hobbyist and a tinkerer. So I sold a lot of those computers. I did several years there. Became a troubleshooter. They would move me from store to store that was in trouble. Then I would fix the store, and essentially move on. And then the personal computer came out in '77, and you couldn't have one in the store. Tandy at the time only made 3,000. They said, you have to have cash money before they would let you have one. So I bought one and I put it on display. And back then I became an expert in personal computing by possession alone. So people would come from different parts of the state and different states to see the only one they could physically see. Right. So I brought, I learned BASIC, wrote some programs, et cetera, wrote a carpool program for City of Columbus, et cetera. And from that, later on, in Columbus, Ohio, two sets of customers were very important to me. One were the engineers at Bell Labs and AT&T. They were buying my computer like crazy, and I had a little user group for them. And then some customers from CompuServe. CompuServe was a commercial service, and some of their engineers would come to my house once a month for a user group meeting, and they would show me all the cool things they could do on a TRS-80 that nobody thought they could do, and that was fun. I got moved to another store at that time, and I lost my connection to Columbus. And because of that, I started using these messages to send back and forth and kind of communicate early store and forward stuff. And I said, there's something here. I'm going to join CompuServe. So I joined them in '79, and the whole purpose was the consumer business did not exist. So we were trying to build a team of 15 of us, this new information age,
right?
Pre-internet, but essentially the same the same concepts and visions that we have today are still the ones we use today. You know, how do you communicate, building a service that's easy for people to use? And this was at modem speeds, if you will, of 30 characters a second, 300 baud. Imagine that. That was faster than we could type, so that was pretty good. But compared to today, it would take many hours to download a simple program.
Right.
But from that magic, they first gave my user group access to their mainframes. And this is my user group, about 100 members. A lot of them were engineers, smarter than I was, and we figured out all kinds of way to hack into the CompuServe system, break it, and have a ball. And that sort of turned me on to big computers as opposed to microcomputers. Joined them, and we started building the information service that we know everyone knows today or knew for many years. That was the golden age of the internet, in my opinion, the early '80s through the maybe up to the mid '90s, because it was a blank whiteboard you had to work with. Yeah, and you had this design stuff. I mean, nobody thought when we talked one Friday. We would usually on a Friday afternoon, we'd get together and brainstorm a little bit, maybe have a glass of wine or two or beer. And we said, how about this thing? You know, I can send this one line message to a computer operator to mount a mag tape or print something for me. Well, if I can do a one line message, why can't I do that to anybody else? And so we thought about this thing called chat. We called it CB Simulator. And our CTO at the time, Sandy Trevor, went home for the weekend and came back Monday with a prototype. And you throw stuff against the wall back then, and nobody thought this would work, and it became popular. I remember once we had gone to a New York trade show, and I was showing them chat, and I can type on the computer here, and the person in San Francisco is typing back. And the guy said, there was actually a science fiction writer at the time who said, why would I want to do that? I can pick up a phone and just call them. I mean, the world was different in 1981 than it is today. But it was exciting, heading times doing it at CompuServe. I left CompuServe and thought we could do our own internet company in 1984. We crashed and burned. It was my first internet failure.
Right.
Way too early in the market. Nobody would pay for it. We did a service from Georgia Online. In the process of that disaster, GE called me and said, you know, we'd like to do something like you did at CompuServe. So I went to CompuServe. We looked at various business plans, and the one that made the most sense was doing the same thing we did at CompuServe. So I built the Genie network, if you will, from that. They gave me petty cash of $60,000 to start this business, me and one engineer. And GE told me to go to New York, hire an advertising agency, and get a name for your business. So this might be too long of a story, but we had gone up there and I said, look, it's a nighttime business, it's a service business, it's something that's magical about what we're doing here online. And so come back and give me a list of names. The best name they came up with was Albert. Albert, for Albert Einstein.
Okay.
I came home in tears. Okay. I just blew 50 grand. And my wife and I sat down in a bed and we started going through a dictionary, and my wife came up with Genie.
Yeah, you know,
we had to figure out what the acronym meant.
I'm surprised that they didn't come up with that themselves, because they literally had, you were working with GE, right? So there's two of the letters are right there.
Oh yeah, and I did want GE in the name. I wanted to somehow get GE, and so they had Imagine and some other things there. But so my wife went through and said, "Oh, genies, that's the word." And I said, so we figured out it meant the General Electric Network for Information Exchange. So we had the acronym before we had the meaning.
Very nice.
I should have paid her the 50 grand. Anyhow, we built Genie. It became a significant competitor, CompuServe, especially for two areas I focused on, which were community, social media platforms. The concept of forums was a name that I coined at CompuServe, coined the term email at CompuServe, and we trademarked it at CompuServe as well. And then I think the following year, we gave it back to the market, but if you will, because that was what you did back then. Right. Anyhow, Genie, we took Genie to Canada, Japan, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, as we expanded it to different countries. And that was a pretty successful business at the time. One of our competitors grew up was AOL. And They were privately funded, and Steve Case was a brilliant tactician. He stole my best marketer, who then eventually married him. And I give him credit for that. But Genie had a problem. We were corporate, and at the time, we were 62% contribution margin. So we had a significant profit margin based on how we were funded, how we looked at our books. And they needed the money because GE Information Services was declining in revenue. So most of my profit went to them. And to me, cash is like cocaine. It's a bad example. Once you start giving it to them, it's hard to start taking it back.
Yeah, there's probably several related examples that we could come up with. They'd all be applicable, I think.
You might want to cut that. In any event, and there was a time when AOL was doing a very much prettier graphic interface, and I said, I need something like that to build it on our stuff, and we were generating something at the time, $20 million more in revenue than GE corporate expected from us. So when I had a deal, I said, if we're doing that, I want 10 million back so I can build this interface that I needed. When we proved the numbers, my boss said, well, I got other projects for that 10 million. So we didn't get it. And that was probably the time I saw some writing on the wall. It was time to move on. Right. And that's when I got to Texas. I went to Texas and started this company that was doing this French technology called US Videotel.
I mean, that's a really great arc, and it's kind of funny. Not funny, but I always like to try to relate a little bit. And although not nearly as in depth or as granular as your experience, my arc in the computer industry, it was similar. So I definitely understand kind of some of the challenges that existed there with, moving ideas that were in that corporate world, and then, they eventually make their way into consumer society and consumer products. That's typically how that goes. But yeah, I remember some of the early challenges of, interface on top of existing application framework. I remember DOS. I mean, I remember that stuff. I remember working with you mentioned early on you work with Radio Shack, and that was some of my first introduction to computers was the old Tandy computers. I mean, I do remember those.
Yep, I had several of those. Built a Heathkit, built an MSI myself. So you were sort of a electrical engineering kind of guy, component guy at the same time I was looking at services. Right.
So that's super interesting, and I think it's very insightful. That ability to kind of to see things and to kind of understand where things are moving. I'm assuming that how do you see that type of skill set, that type of experience and background? How do you see that applying in a city like Leander? Like, how would you work some of those obvious business acumen into a public space or a position on city council?
Sure. Well, first, you've got to work within the box to change the box. So I think you have to be part of the process if you want to look at some significant changes, which is the first thing I look at. You also have to be able to take yourself out of the box and look at it more objectively. What's it doing? How is it? Can I make it better? If you're in the system and you're comfortable in the status quo, you're not going to change anything. I have always been one where I understand the status quo, but you've got to change and keep pushing the envelope to do more and more. And you're going to push the envelope to things that people never thought you could do. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the excitement in anything that I have ever built. I've always thought of myself as a carpenter. I like to work with wood, but I like to build companies. I like to build projects, products, and I like to build people, mentor people. It's all about the same process, taking them to another dimension, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I know that you've served on a couple of advisory boards for the Internet Industry Association, mid '90s. It looks like you've done some volunteer work with St. Vincent de Paul Society.
Right.
How what in Leander? I mean, have you participated in any whether it's with the Chamber of Commerce or any local HOAs or anything along those lines?
Well, I'm the first resident elected to the board of my HOA. So I am the resident liaison on the HOA, if you will, and the majority of the other board members are the builders and developers.
Okay.
So I'm still a minority voice speaking to them, but I've learned how to manage that and accomplish things and find common ground, if you will, because builders have a different objective,
Yep,
and priorities than the homeowners do. And I think I'm just as adept at finding out what grass needs to be mowed because it isn't done versus setting strategy on multiple countries. So
right.
sometimes you have sometimes I love sometimes just getting my hands dirty. You have to get down and dirty to do things, and then you have to be able to step back and look at that much more strategically.
Yep. No, I would completely concur with that. I like the fact that you refer to yourself as a liaison within the HOA. We have a similar situation in my community with the lack of a liaison, to be frank, because to your point, the builders and the developers have a specific, and this is not a bump against them. They that's their business. They have priorities and goals that they need to achieve. But I've always felt that that's one of the things that maybe Leander could do a little better job of is giving a little bit of a stronger voice to the people who are actually living in the city.
Right.
I know that we have to rely on developers for a lot of things, and it's part of the process right now. We're in that growth, that explosive growth period, and so for the foreseeable future, that is something that we're going to have to be able to try to get our hands around and try to address. So let's talk a little bit about that from the perspective of where Leander is growing. There's a lot of conversation about, are we a bedroom community, or are we a developing, maybe an urban center that will build inside of this bedroom community, or are we an old country town on the outskirts of Austin, Texas? I mean, all of those things are part of the conversation. So help me understand where you I want to say where you land on that, but what your thoughts are there.
Well, in 2002, Leander was a small town of 7,500 people. Last year, it's at 75,000 people in 15 years. I mean, tenfold growth. I mean, it's an order of magnitude growth. So we're no longer a small town. Mm-hmm. We are a small city and becoming more self-sustaining as a city themselves. And with that number, you think, wow, it's got to stop. But the projections are we're going to add another 25,000 people in the next 5 years. That's 10,000 more homes, 10,000 more places to live. And we need multifamily apartments. We probably need condos. We probably need more senior living places. We need single family homes, and we probably need some place for estates. So that entire income range has to be served. And so developers are frankly chomping at the bit to do that. That's a good thing. I believe that part of the city's job is to help, I hate to use the word regulate, but help manage that. I would rather do that as partners with these developers than just consider them a contractor. They're not some third party doing something and I can just wash my hands. We've got to do it in concert.
Yep.
We also need, the city wants, in my opinion, we've got some great parks, but I want to see more parks. I want to see smaller neighborhood parks, plazas, if you will, like I've seen in other countries, where people just gather on a Sunday and just enjoy themselves and talk to one another. We don't have much of that. We got some great big parks. I live right next to Divine Lake, which is, I love the park there. But, can we build smaller communities, or do we have to rely on each neighborhood building their own? I think there's a way of trying to partner with them to build that community spirit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think. What are your understandings of, say, like the comprehensive plan? Have you looked that over? Has that given you some ideas as to where Leander could go, and comparative to where they might be headed today?
I got 300 pages of it somewhere. I can't even print it on my printer. I have gone through parts of it. I wouldn't say I'm intimately familiar with it.
Okay.
There's some good things in the plan. I mean, there's some good aspirations. And I think Christine, our mayor, is doing a good job setting a better vision. I love her transparency. I would like to support that, and then challenge her. I mean, I look at myself and say, I worked for two very famous managers in my career. I worked for Jack Welch, who always wanted people to challenge his thinking. But darn, you better be right. You might show them a one-page. My business was small enough that only took one-page PowerPoint slide to tell them what my business is doing for 6 months, and I might have 200 pages of backup. My other boss was a Rupert Murdoch, News Corporation. He bought one of the internet companies I was working for, and I was charged with building a new one for him in London. Different kind of boss. He loved 20th Century Fox folks around him, and a lot of praise, and didn't like people to contradict him, if you will. But to me, I mean, I want to be that challenge. I may agree with you on some things, but let's look at some things that are realistic, and how do we do it? We need sensible balance in the community between developers, builders, businesses, and us, and we have to balance the needs of today with our aspirations of tomorrow. That's a challenge, right?
Yeah.
Because the aspirations of tomorrow, for example, I think we need a third water plant so we never have to boil water again. And redundant plant. That's a large project. You've got to start building that today if you want it ready in 5 years.
Right.
I'd rather be ahead of the curve than behind it. But that also puts pressure on us today to spend the money, invest today for a return we're going to see in 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, and I mean, I know that in many times the complexity of that particular equation can get lost in the information or disinformation, depending on how you look at it or where you're consuming, that is generally an oversimplification of what it is that you're trying to accomplish at the end of the day. And I think that's generally speaking something that happens across the board. And from your business background, I'm sure that you can understand what I mean by that, in that you need to have the information and the data that support decision-making process. However, you cannot overlook the overarching or holistic situation. You can't just be so, and there's nothing wrong with burying your head in data. I think that's always a good dive to take, and it's a good place to learn. But you have to be able to take that data now and apply it in a sensible manner, and not one that just supports your particular position because, well, now I have some data to support something that I've said before. I think that we're getting better as a community in doing that. I think that we're taking more steps to inform decision making. Yeah. But with that said, I really feel we've got a long way to go before we really get astute at that.
It's a challenge the internet brings to us. I built a company in Las Vegas called 3DV8, which we were trying to visualize this huge amounts of data that one can collect, whether it's whatever it is. And you can get a tsunami of data, but you present that to the CEO who has to make decisions, and it's it's gobbledygook. It makes no sense whatsoever. So we had built a software program that would visualize it and take these 30,000 data bits and put it into a very simple format that he could use and then manipulate without an expert statistician behind him doing the work. That was a challenge to build, but it was pretty successful, I think, in terms of that. And we have that problem. If I have 300 pages of a business plan and I need to condense that to present to CEO of GE, he wants to see one page. What's the problem? What's the status? What's the problem? How are you going to solve it? What's the result? Very, very standard, four slot kind of thing. And then usually the takeaway at the bottom of the slide was, I know what I'm doing, Jack, give me the money, right? So it's sort of a confident thing you would build, showing him. But if you question one bullet point, you had 200 pages or so to follow back up and say, let me show you the detail.
Right.
I am looking at our plan and our budget today, and it is overwhelming. But you start looking at it department by department. There's some things I see right now. There's a historical site called the Bryson Farmstead, which we have a budget this year of $917,000 we're going to spend on this farm. And they've already put 300,000 into it because it's essentially, no offense to the historical society, it's a rundown, falling down wooden building. Some of that should be preserved, but it's $1 million. What else could we do with that? That might be smarter. If we want to restore it, why don't we turn it into a restored village where people could tour it as seeing what it is like back in the 1800s when this was built, as opposed to just making the barn stand straight up. So those are things that I think we should do in many respects, but I would second twice. If we didn't do that, that's another $1 million that comes back into the city's coffers. We could do something else.
I think it's an interesting point. Bill, I mean, you're the first person to raise something like that I've spoken with over the past couple of years. Not to say that people were not considering those particular items, but I think it's really interesting that that's one of the first things that you bring up. And I think that is a little bit of an insight into how you think. So I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that the viewers of my podcast and the people who will listen to this interview will gain a lot of insight into what type of leadership you are proposing as a candidate for yourself. So I know that we probably could go on for a lot longer, but I think we've gotten a good sense of who you are, and I appreciate your time here today. What I'd like to do is offer you, obviously, the opportunity to speak directly to the audience here and tell them where they can find out a little bit more about you and get information on your candidacy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Loudenforleander.com. It's number 4. And I also have a Facebook for the same thing. And on there, you'll see more issues that I'm focusing on from Cat Metro up and down the line of things that I think we need to look at. I'm very concerned about many of the propositions that are on the ballot this time as well. Even if you don't vote for me, of the 15 propositions, I think it's C through K.
Yeah,
Many of them are limiting the power of mayor and limiting the powers of city council and giving it to a city manager. And I think that's exactly the wrong thing we should be doing. City managers is a hired CEO, and we are the board, and he should report to us. And if he's not doing a job, we should have the power to remedy the situation. And I think some of the proposals are trying to change that or limit when something happens. And I think that's something citizens should look at very carefully on how they vote on those issues, even more than the train. Even if they don't vote for me, I think those are important issues to consider this May 7th.
Well, I appreciate you bringing those up. Again, a nice insight into your thought process, because I'm very fond of here on the podcast and as part of the Vote in Leander series, I talk about that quite a bit. I encourage people to educate themselves and to understand what it is that the city is doing, because your local vote is the most impactful. This is the thing that's going to impact your personal life, as opposed to some of the more largesse of national politics and regional politics, it's not going to have the same type of impact.
And we as a community need to do a lot more to encourage more people to get out and vote.
I agree.
It's such a small percentage of people that are actually participating.
I
They're controlling the lives of another 75,000 people, right? We
Yep.
need to get more people in the process. That'll help everybody.
I agree. I agree. I'm the choir on that one because that's usually my refrain let's get more people involved. Let's get more education on the topics that are affecting not only our city but the citizens of our city.
Right.
Because again, that local vote is the one that really impacts really everything that you do when you're living in a city. And we're in a unique situation here in Leander in that not only are we impacting what's going on today, but we are setting the table for what the future of this city will be. And so I think we need to be very judicious in the way that we move forward, and in recognizing that fact alone.
I agree. In my business career, I worked and lived in 2 countries and 8 states and 13 or 14 cities. So I've seen small cities, large cities, cities that are, one city I recall, the beer hall was 400 years old, and they made the beer in the basement. It was the same building they used 400 years ago. And then I've seen new cities that are spreading up too. I think there's a lot of experience there. I see what other cities have done well, and perhaps we can learn from them as well.
I agree. And I wish you nothing but the best of luck in your candidacy. I hope that people will take the opportunity to learn a little bit more about you as a candidate. And I have been very pleased to have had the opportunity to meet you. I certainly hope we have some future interaction in and around the city. Don't be a stranger. I try not to be.
I won't be. My pleasure to speak to you as well, Andrew. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Thank you so much for your time, Bill. I do appreciate it.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.